Hello, everyone. It's Mr. Nobody. I just wanted to take a short amount of time to talk about something. And it's something that's been on my mind after some discussions that I had with people. It has to do with the recent revocation of the Roe versus Wade verdict, and a lot of people have been discussing lots of things related to abortion. When I was in graduate school, I was very involved in this discussion. I had my ethics professor in graduate school was very famous for his work advancing a lot of philosophical arguments that were in favor of abortion, a lot of which are very popular today. And my advisor, too, in graduate school was also very active on the subject, but in a somewhat more extreme corner of it, he took things so far that he was pro-infanticide up to a certain age. And so these were the guys that I worked with every day. These were my teachers. These were my advisors. These were, my ethics professor. I followed the ethics track. And so I wrote my capstone paper actually as a response to his award-winning book on abortion, which of course was a pro-abortion book. So I thought, well, I'll write my own book-length rebuttal. And luckily, he had a very good attitude about it. I expected him to be very fair. Actually, he was a good teacher. And so the fact that I seriously engaged with his book and wrote a much longer response than the paper is supposed to be. The papers were supposed to be large papers. When you're in graduate school, your papers are large. But I went way, way beyond the scope of the assignment. And he gave me an A for that. And so I really appreciated the fact that he saw that I had taken his argument seriously, engaged with them. But there's something I did want to actually talk about. It's not abortion per se that I want to talk about. It's analogies. That's something that if you do work in ethics and philosophy, you end up getting all these analogies and all of these theoretical problems, and you get the trolley, puzzle, and with abortion, the famous one is the violinist argument. And I personally am of the opinion that these analogies are not actually theoretical situations like that are not necessarily illuminating. They're more like legal problems. They're more like puzzles. They're the kind of things that like lawyers trot out. They don't really actually help you that much with real life. And after having spent years talking with people, what I realized was people's ethical instincts did not derive from their knowledge they gained from these puzzles or the solutions to them. Their ethical instincts came from somewhere else, and then the puzzles just either fit and affirmed what they already thought or didn't. And so they weren't really very much worth discussing. And we covered many subjects. Of course, in graduate school, everyone had an opportunity to talk about their particular thing. A lot of what I like to talk about was philosophy and its intersection with ordinary human life, making it comprehensible, how to use ordinary language, how to take stuff that's very deep and fundamental to human life, but the necessity of being able to take it out into the world and into actual practical application. And I spent a lot of time arguing that if you didn't know how to do that or didn't understand how to do that, or it wasn't possible to do that with your theories, then actually you didn't understand them or your theory wasn't very good. Because philosophy actually needs to be livable. It needs to be a pathway, not just some subject matter for professionals to quibble over. Anyway, something that I noticed, and this is sort of an opinion that I realized, is the problem of metaphors. So why do we use metaphors and stories, and these sort of problems to look at ethical questions? And often it's to simplify them, to add clarity, to bring out certain elements of them, to try and say, well, I've managed to pull out and extract the key thing about this situation. We've managed to abstract the bit that's giving us difficulty, and this lets us look at it in different ways. It's also the case that morality has an enormous amount of contextual processing. What we have to say, it's not just a one value thing, it's a whole bunch of values that you're trying to balance and that you're trying to work out complexly to this best outcome. You're navigating time in a way. You're looking back at the way things have gone. You're looking forward to the way things could go. You're looking at your principles. You're looking at the outcomes. You're not just doing one thing. And the problem with so many systems, ethical systems, is they try to boil things down too much to something so simple and so formulaic that it's like, now I just have a machine. I can just always be right. I can always generate the right answers. And that's not really how morality works. I'm a little more of a virtue ethicist, and then I think morality is a skill you develop. It's a strength. It's a thing you become. And when you become that thing, it is that you have actually become the kind of person who has gained strength and skill and ability at actually navigating something terribly complex and processing something terribly complex. And then also have these virtues that allow you not only to process it, but to actually carry it forward into action. Because it's not that great if you can figure out what you should do, but then you lack the courage or patience or conviction to actually do it. That might be moral knowledge, but that's not ultimately the only end goal of moral knowledge. So we create these situations. The problem with these theoretical situations and metaphors is that they're only as good as they actually copy and track the problem. And that is often the grounds on which they are attacked, and that is often the grounds on which they should be attacked. As I said, people are very contextual, and so sometimes you do need to reframe a problem so you can look at it more clearly, because you might have had past experiences or emotional experiences that cloud your ability to actually look at that situation and see what your ethical instincts are and how your ethical arguments apply. And so people see this where people will argue against something and then they'll go do it, or if for something they believe in, and they'll completely violate that principle. You see that all the time in politics, where politicians do the exact same thing that a year ago they were complaining about someone else doing. So that's very common. That's a very human thing. But as I said, you also have these hang-ups of associations, and I've seen people even do tricks with this, where they're like, okay, we're going to talk about this issue and we're going to talk about this problem, and we're just going to change the word and find some other word, because clearly this word triggers all of this baggage that you are covertly importing into your processing of this problem, and we just need to get you some space from that so that you have a chance to look at it more clearly and see if that's not interfering with it. So maybe you have a problem that involves parents. But then let's say you're dealing with someone who's had really bad experiences with parents, and that is actually a major player in how they interpret that situation. And so you say, okay, I need to reframe this ethical question in a way that avoids knocking into these other things that you're bringing to the table, which act as hidden premises and hidden conclusions. So that's why you do things like, analogies, metaphors, problems. Like I say, it's a way of abstracting the problem and trying to look at it in different ways. One problem I, of course, had, I remember very clearly sitting, we took turns in one of my classes where all we did all semester long was each person developed their own lecture on sub-subject, and then we each took turns delivering that lecture to all of the other graduate students, and then we talk about it. And I remember there was one guy who was very smart. I think he actually already had a law degree, but he was very interested in science. He was a very technical philosopher, and he was doing a very complicated theory that had to do with time and numbers and dividing things up, dividing time into smaller and smaller subsections, and that you start running into all these strange problems of, well, how do you move from A to B when A to B can be infinitely subdivided, all sorts of things like that. So he had all these very complicated theories by which he proved things that were directly in contradiction to all of ordinary human experience. And to him, that was very exciting. And to me, I just looked at it and said, well, if I have to throw complicated abstract theory versus all human experience, and they're giving me completely contradictory results, which one is the most likely one to actually be wrong? And the problem is people can really fall in love with their metaphor. So I looked at it and I read his whole paper. He had wonderful graphs and all these pictures and drawings and things. And I looked at it and I said, this is a great draft. The problem is this is just entirely a fiction of your own mind. Like, this is entirely an abstract imposition on the actual experience that people have. No one actually experiences life like this. So the only problem with this is that it's just completely not true at all. In any way. No one experiences life in the manner in which you are describing. No one experiences time or events in the manner and way in which you are describing. It is entirely an abstract, constructed, rational and mathematical artifice. So that's all I said. The only problem with this is that just none of it has anything to do with real life. This is all just from your own personal fantasy world. And I'm pretty sure the rules that govern your fantasy world actually don't hold in the ordinary world. So if there's a conflict generated between the two, I'm going to side with reality and every human that's ever lived. And so, that was a good example to me of just how we can build these gigantic castles and these gigantic theories, and then they generate answers, and then you're like, ooh, the answer conflicts with some really fundamental and easy to access things in life. Which is most likely to be wrong? Well, it's most likely that your castle's wrong, and you've messed up your analogy. Your analogy does not actually track the reality that it pretends to be tracking. So that was the problem with his theory, is he was trying to talk about the experience of time, but he failed to do so because his analogy, his abstraction about the experience of time 100% did not match what anyone actually experienced. So, mismatch between metaphor and the thing that it's attempting to give you a description of. And so that came back into my mind as I've been hearing things like the violinist argument brought up again, because that's another prime example. It's an example that is meant to be the best abortion argument and yet tracks the problem so badly that I don't understand. Like, there's so many better arguments, so many better arguments. I mean, just as someone who's spent a lot of time with them, I think there's a lot of very good arguments related to the subject of abortion, even for abortion. And I'll say that as someone who has spent, a lifetime arguing back against them. You can't do that unless you respect those positions enough to take them seriously as positions and to actually engage with them. That's how I got that A from my professor who wrote the APA award-winning book on it, because he realized I took his position seriously as a position. I recognized its merits, and now I'm ready to engage with it. But the violinist argument is just an absolute mess. I can't remember anymore. It's been so long, even though I wrote that huge essay in response to that book of my professor's. Unfortunately, off the top of my head, I can't remember anything that I actually had to say. But I do remember this conclusion that I drew in general, which is that theoretical situations like that, theoretical problems, as I said, they're two biggest things you need to ask about them. Is this really just legal quibbling? Is this actually trying to solve the problem? Does this acknowledge the actual real life fact of morality, which is that it's not purely theoretical? You actually have to make choices, and those choices are often forced on you, and often you have a limited amount of time to make them. And so often you're not really navigating the best in every case. You're trying to do the best you can with the time that you have, and maybe you don't even like either of the situations. But if you're forced into a choice between two bad options, that doesn't mean that good doesn't exist or that they aren't both still bad options. It it means you've just tried to make the least bad out of that situation. And so people try to pull way more out of these legal problems than you really should. And if you're a Christian, I think a good example of this is the Pharisees and the speakers of law. Jesus is coming around talking to actual people, trying to give them a lot of, real life understanding of things. And the lawyers want to come up and set little legal traps for him, and he just blows his way out of them, blows his way through them, turns them around, says, what point are you really trying to address? Or he just completely changes the context of the discussion to get to what's actually deeper in it, because he's not there to prove how smart he is by which is what some of that game is. It's just saber rattling, really, and intimidation. It's not really substantive discussion. He actually wants to get to the people and say, what is the real struggle here? He's not here to play legal games. And so much of those ethical analogies end up just being legal games that are really just traps. I'm not saying there aren't good answers to them. I'm just saying a lot of the time they're non-productive. Anyway, so to return to the violinist argument, as I said, the problem with that one especially, like if I just had to throw out one thing to criticize it for, is boy does it track the situation that's meant to help you abstract poorly. This if you're not familiar with it, there's this idea of you wake up and you have been surgically attached to a violinist, and if they're detached from you, they will die. And they're wonderful. They're one of the most talented and precious violinists in the world. So there's some innate value there. You see value in the person, and you see that to detach them and have them die would be a bad thing. Okay, that seems good. And if you leave them attached for a certain amount of time, he will recover, and then he can go and live. Now, there's so many ways you could dig into this problem. There's so many directions you could come at it from. I certainly spent a lot of time talking about it when I was responding to my ethics professor, who spent a lot of time focusing on it and articulating it. And for all I know, it was that book, it was probably 15 years ago, was one of the books that really helped push it into the mainstream as a pro-abortion argument. But it's so weird, because one of the things that you have to track, if you're tracking something like sex and pregnancy, to have an analogy that completely leaves out any analogical element for paternity. The fact that this isn't just some violinist. Maybe it would be better, and you could make these adjustments, say, well, it's not just some violinist, it's a violinist that you yourself trained. This was your personal student. That's still not a wonderful, that's still not a great analogy, but at least it includes that element, paternity. This isn't just any person. This is someone. This is someone that is part of you. This is something that is a part of you. This is cells. And of course, there are arguments that can be made pro-abortion along this direction, but these are your living cells that combined with another cell and continued living. This was a literal part of you that has taken on this new existence and this new direction and this new identity. But this new identity is literally part of you, formed of you, carrying things that are uniquely generated from you. This isn't just some stranger. This is a part of yourself you will actually have to directly do violence to, not just some random person you've never met that just showed up. The idea is maybe something if you said, well, and if this violinist survived and recovered, they would go on to make the music that would be about you and about how you carried them and saved them for the rest of their life. There's a deep paternity is a non-significant element of pregnancy and also of abortion. To what degree, what is the significance of destroying something that proceeds from you like this? What is the significance of doing violence to something that is so deeply connected to you and a part of you? So there's no analogical element in that metaphor for that, and that is humongous oversight, gigantic. Like, that alone for me is just like, you need to completely rethink this. You need to completely restructure this. And then the second thing, of course, has to do with genetic origin, and by that I don't mean like genes. I mean in the sense of how did this happen? The analogy is basically present of, you go to bed one night and you just wake up and there's a violinist attached to you by force from some unknown external thing. And it's very strange because, people talk about abortion like forced birth, and it's like, well, who's forcing you to give birth? The answer is you, your body. Especially if you're a materialist, what are you other than your body? Your body will do everything to prevent you from succeeding in this abortion. Your body wants you to give birth. Your body is the protagonist and antagonist in here. You're fighting an internal war against yourself, not against some external force or even something external that has colonized you necessarily. Like I said, this is something made from you. This is this is something deeply connected to yourself, and it's a little late to argue that people don't know that sex and reproduction are connected. Like, maybe you could argue there's some animals that don't know it. I mean, because they don't have to, because their instincts are so much simpler. I'm pretty sure most humans at this point are fully aware that reproduction and sex have some connection to it. And you have some participatory action in that. Now, of course, there are cases, including like involuntary pregnancy, things like rape, and that adds extra layers to the question, but don't really come in to this analogy. This isn't meant to be a only rape analogy, where some great wrong has been committed by someone else, and that's why we're trying to deal with it. That changes things, like I said, because like, ooh, we've already got a major mistake in play, and that's messing with what's going on. And so no matter what, nobody's going to be necessarily completely happy here. But most people know that sex and pregnancy have some connection. And so if I was to retool the analogy, I would say it's more like, let's say that instead of just waking up that way, the previous day you were walking around and there was a machine, and it was the violinist attaching machine. And you talked to people and said, tell me about this machine. And they explained it in detail, and you said, oh, yeah, I actually know, because every book and every song and every movie that exists talks about the violinist attaching machine. And you say, I was thinking about sticking my head in the violinist attaching machine. And someone said, yeah, well, if you do that, you might end up with violinist attached to you. And the person said, yeah, I've heard that, but I've also heard the machine can be turned off. The people say, yeah, you can check to see if the machine's on or not. You can flick the switches, you can do some things. But, that's actually something you have to do. And then you decided to stick your head into the violinist attaching machine, and maybe you checked to see if it was on or off. Maybe you didn't. Maybe you flicked the switches. Maybe the switches didn't work. People probably told you, yeah, most of the time the switches work, but, sometimes they're faulty. The next day you wake up and there's a violinist attached to you, and you go, holy cow, how could there be a violinist attached to me? I think I have a right to get rid of them. And if it had been sneakily done to in the night with no knowledge or no participation, then we might interpret the situation one way. On the other hand, if you had literally walked around sticking your head into various violinist attaching machines and then were upset that in fact you had ended up with one attached to you, we might say, well, that sort of alters my instincts, because it's not just something you could have no expectation that this outcome could occur. And so why should the violinist pay the price for the fact that you did something despite knowing that what you were doing, that was what the machine was designed to do? Like, it's not a machine for something else. It's a violinist attaching machine. But you thought it'd be pretty fun. Like I said, so there's this question of agency. The paternity is not being tracked by the metaphor. Agency is not being tracked by the metaphor. Those are just two minor problems with that metaphor. If you're going to build a metaphor, it needs to contain the most essential elements of the problem that you're trying to track. And with something like sex and pregnancy, paternity is an essential question, and then also agency is an essential question, and so your analogy needs to track that. So that's just a little bit that I wanted to bring up about that particular subject, that particular metaphor. I think you could try and rebuild it to make it better, but in its current form, it's incredibly messy. It's so weird. It doesn't sound anything like what pregnancy is actually like. Like, anyone who has been pregnant or knows anything about pregnancy understands that the violinist argument is genuinely nothing like the situation of pregnancy. Almost in no respect. It in no way helps. It abstracts so far away from the reality, and it's one of those cases where, why does it abstract so much? I would say not to provide clarity, to actually provide obscurance. And you can do that with an analogy too. You can create a metaphor whose purpose is in many ways to obscure key factors of the actual situation so that you don't have to deal with them or think about them. And it lets you drop things and hide things so that you don't really have to think about it in ways. It allows you to abstract away from the reality, but not in a way that collectivizes all the essential features, but rather allows you to discard them as you please. And so that's something, any metaphor someone uses in arguing with things, that's why you always have to challenge them, you have to think about them, you have to see if you can build a better one. And sometimes you even have to build a better one for your opponent, because they won't always do it on themselves. Yeah, that's something to watch out for. Like I said, that abstracting can accomplish a couple different things. It can allow you to collate a sort of super reality by pulling the most important parts out of things and pulling them collectively together so you can look at them more clearly with the less necessary and distracting bits trimmed away. But if the person you're working with is more of an intellectual butcher of no great talent, they're going to cut off the important parts of the meat, they're going to keep a lot of gristle and a lot of fat, and they're going to collect you a nice big lump of tripe and say, okay, try to figure out try to make a good meal out of this. And that becomes very difficult. Anyway, so that's some of my thoughts on the subject, and that's all for today. We'll see you later.